September 1915, northern France. A German trench line near Loos. A tired young soldier peers into the morning fog, expecting the same boring routine. A few shells, some rifle cracks, maybe a night patrol that ends with everyone shivering and angry. His unit has sat on this stretch of front for weeks. No big pushes, no dramatic breakthroughs, just mud, rats, and the slow grind of waiting. Then the fog shifts. Shapes rise from the British trench about a quarter-mile away. Not a rush, not a sprint. They're coming forward, like they're marching. And the German soldier freezes because his brain won't accept what his eyes are seeing. They look like they're wearing skirts, not coats, not capes, not odd rain gear. Skirts. For a second, he wonders if he's losing it from exhaustion, but other men around him see it too. Someone mutters a curse. Someone laughs in disbelief. Someone else stops laughing because the shapes keep coming. Then the sound hits. Bagpipes. Not a bugle. Not a drum line. Not a familiar marching tune. A harsh, wailing noise that seems to cut through the fog and crawl straight into your nerves. The Germans open fire. Machine guns hammer. Rifles snap. Shells burst and kick dirt into the air. This is what no man's land is for, to turn any attacker into a pile of bodies before they ever reach the wire. But the figures don't break. They don't scatter. They don't dive for cover like everyone else has learned to do in modern war. They just keep coming, steady, deliberate, like the bullets and blasts are just weather. And as the fog thins, the Germans finally understand. Those aren't British line troops in standard kit. Those are Scottish soldiers in kilts, moving forward with a kind of calm that looks insane from the other side. When they reach the wire, they don't stop to carefully cut lanes like most units try to do. Men grab it, yank it, shove it down. Some use their bare hands, some use tools, some just throw their bodies into the mess so others can climb over. Then they drop into the trench. And suddenly, it's not a long-distance war anymore. It's close, dirty, fast. The Germans who survive long enough to crawl away don't describe it as a normal assault. They describe it like something worse, like the rules changed the moment the kilts reached the line. That first shock, seeing men in skirts advance under fire, didn't just scare German troops in one sector. It spread. Word travels fast in trench warfare because fear travels fast. And soon the nickname starts showing up, the Ladies from Hell. At first it's mockery, a way to make sense of the weird sight, a way to laugh off something you don't understand. But it doesn't stay a joke, because every time those kilts appear again, the results keep being the same. Positions that held against other attacks suddenly collapse, not because Scottish units had special weapons, but because they fought like they were built for close-range violence. If you're into WWII stories like this, where reputation becomes a weapon, hit like and subscribe now, because this one only gets darker from here. Here's the thing. German military intelligence wasn't clueless. By early 1915, the Germans had studied the British Army. They knew Britain used regional regiments, English county units, Welsh battalions, Irish divisions. Scottish regiments were in the files too. But in those papers, Scottish units looked like historical leftovers, old Highland traditions, famous names, lots of pride, a reputation built in earlier wars. And the kilts. German analysts basically treated them like a parade costume, something you wear for ceremonies, not for an industrial meat grinder filled with machine guns and artillery. From a modern standpoint, that assumption sounds reasonable. In 1915, war wasn't about looking bold. It was about camouflage, cover, and surviving the first 10 seconds over the top. So German planners figured Scottish units would fight like everyone else once the firing started. Same fear, same breakdown under heavy fire, same limits. That assessment was wrong, not because Scots were superhuman, but because their regimental culture pushed them to fight in a way that felt different to the enemy, more aggressive, more willing to close the distance, more willing to take the kind of losses that would make other units stall. And the pieces that looked old-fashioned, kilts and pipes, weren't just tradition. They were part of the weapon system. The kilt, in the mud of France, wasn't a fashion statement. It was an identity marker. It said, "We are not here to blend in. We are here to come get you." To a German soldier trained to expect practical uniforms and cautious movement, the sight was unsettling. It created a mental glitch. These men looked wrong for this battlefield, but they were still coming. That mismatch, absurd appearance, lethal behavior did something to morale. It made the attacker seem fearless, even when fear had to be there like it was for everyone else. Then there were the bagpipes. German troops understood military music. They knew bands and marches and the basic idea of keeping men moving. But the pipes were different. They didn't sound clean or comforting. They sounded raw, loud, and impossible to ignore. They didn't blend into the background like drums might. They sat on top of everything. The shells, the rifle shots, the shouted orders, and kept screaming. That mattered because trenches weren't just physical defenses. They were mental ones. If you could shake a man's focus right before impact, you could make him shoot too high, reload too slow, hesitate for half a second at the worst time, and Scottish units kept using that effect. The first major clashes in 1915, like the fighting at Neuve-Chapelle, burned the lesson into German memory. Positions that had resisted multiple attacks suddenly got overrun when Scots pushed across open ground and reached the wire anyway. German defenders later wrote and talked about the same pattern. They fired until barrels heated, watched attackers fall, and still saw enough of them keep moving to hit the trench line. And once Scots got into the trench, the fight became personal. Bayonets, rifles used like clubs, entrenching tools, hands, anything that worked. That kind of violence didn't feel normal, even by Western Front standards. It felt like being jumped in a narrow hallway with nowhere to run. So the nickname evolved. Ladies from Hell stopped being a joke about skirts. It became a warning label. And as the months passed, another grim idea started forming, not as a clean official policy stamped and signed, but as a brutal battlefield habit. Scottish prisoners, some Germans decided, were dangerous to handle. Not because Scots were magical, but because units that fought with that level of aggression were harder to control, even after surrender. Guards worried about sudden resistance, hidden weapons, desperate last swings, and soldiers who had just watched friends get killed in close combat were less likely to offer mercy in the first place. That's how wars get uglier, not always through one big order from the top, but through small choices made by scared men who don't want to get stabbed while doing the right thing. By 1916 and 1917, German troops facing kilts and pipes often didn't need a briefing. They felt the dread the moment the sound started at dawn. Pipes first, then the bombardment, then figures moving through smoke. And the worst part, even heavy fire didn't always stop the advance, because what the Germans were really facing wasn't just a uniform or a song. They were facing a tactic, an old idea reborn in modern slaughter, a massed charge that shouldn't work in the age of machine guns, but sometimes did anyway. And in the next part, we're going to get into why. How the Highland charge broke perfect defenses, why German positions that should have held still collapsed, and how fear, real, physical fear, started shaping German decisions whenever Scottish units showed up. By 1916, the Ladies from Hell nickname wasn't a punchline anymore. German troops still joked sometimes. Soldiers will joke about anything, but it had a different edge now. Not laughter, more like a nervous habit, because once you've watched men in kilts walk forward through a kill zone like the laws of war don't apply to them, your brain files that away as a threat. And the kilts were only the first hit. The pipes were the second. German units were used to battlefield noise, guns, shells, shouting, but bagpipes cut through it all. The sound didn't sit in the background. It sat on top of everything, loud and sharp, like it was aimed directly at the nerves. Worse, it often showed up before the attack did. When pipes started up at dawn, men in German trenches didn't need binoculars to guess what was coming next. They'd learned the sequence the hard way. Pipes, then artillery. Then shapes in the smoke advancing without the usual hesitation. That's why German troops began trying to kill the piper first. It wasn't superstition, it was instinct. Silence the sound, settle your men, restore control. A lot of units started treating pipers the way snipers treated officers, high priority targets. But it didn't solve the problem, because pipers didn't always stop playing when wounded. And even when a piper went down, another man could pick up the instrument and keep the sound going. The message to the defenders was brutal and simple. You can shoot the musician, but you can't stop the music. And that constant wail did something to the mind. It made men rush their shots. It made them fire too early. It made them waste ammo at the wrong moment. It made them feel like the attack had already started. Even before the first figures appeared, German soldiers wrote about it in diaries and letters, how that sound made it hard to think straight, how it ruined sleep, how it turned anticipation into dread. You can train a soldier to handle danger, but it's harder to train a soldier to handle the feeling that danger is inevitable and closing fast. Then came the part that really broke people, the way Scottish units moved when they decided to go. Most armies on the Western Front fought with a grim logic. Suppress the enemy, crawl forward, take cover, repeat. It was slow, methodical, and miserable, but it was how you stayed alive. The Highland-style charge was something else. Not always a wild sprint from the first step. More often it began with a fast, organized advance. Tight spacing, arrow officers forward, then a sudden acceleration in the last stretch when the distance was short enough that hesitation meant dying anyway. To German defenders, it felt like watching men deliberately cross a death zone without accepting the usual rules of survival. And here's the ugly truth. Machine guns did kill them in huge numbers. That's not propaganda. That's the real cost. But German defenses were built around an assumption. If you kill enough attackers, the rest will stop. Break or go to ground. Scottish units, at least in the actions that built this reputation, didn't always do that. Enough of them kept moving that they reached the wire, and once attackers hit the wire, things got chaotic fast. Wire wasn't just a barrier, it was a trap. Men got tangled and stuck. Bodies piled up. A smart defense could mow down wave after wave right there, but some Scottish assaults pushed through anyway, sometimes in the most horrifying way possible. The first men at the wire went down, and later men crossed over the crushed, weighted-down mess left behind. That image, men climbing over bodies while pipes screamed, stuck in German memory like a nightmare that wouldn't fade. There's a reason it hit so hard, because on paper, German defenses should have been unbeatable. Interlocking fields of machine gun fire, wire belts, pre-sighted artillery, trenches built to absorb shock. This was the modern system, and it worked against most attacks. So when a position still fell after the defenders had done everything right, the defenders didn't just feel beaten, they felt like the world had stopped making sense. That's what the kilts did to the mind. They started as something absurd, something that should have been laughable. But when the absurd thing keeps coming, the brain flips the meaning. The kilt stops being funny and becomes a symbol. These men are different, not better equipped, not magically protected, different in the way they accept risk, different in how quickly they close, different in how violent the fight becomes once they reach the trench line. And trench fighting was the worst place to meet that kind of enemy. In open ground, you can at least pretend the battlefield is fair, two lines trading fire. In a trench, it becomes a series of sudden collisions in narrow spaces where fear and adrenaline take over, rifles become clubs, bayonets come out, shovels and knives appear. Men don't think about tactics, they think about surviving the next 5 seconds. If a unit develops a reputation for loving that kind of fight, if defenders believe the attackers actually want to get into the trench, then the defenders start making different choices long before the enemy arrives. This is where the fear turned into a real tactical problem for Germany, because fear doesn't just hurt morale, it breaks timing. Machine guns require discipline, short controlled bursts, clear lanes, steady hands. Artillery defense requires coordination. Holding a trench requires men to stay put when every instinct screams at them to run. Now imagine you've heard the stories. You've read the rumors. You've watched other units collapse after men in skirts arrived. You hear pipes beginning in the dark. Your stomach tightens. Your hands start shaking. Your unit starts firing too soon. And when the attackers finally appear, your barrels are already hot, your ammo is lower than it should be, and your mind is already half panicked. Some German accounts from the front make that exact point without trying to be poetic. The pipes and the reputation did damage before the first bayonet even hit. One diary entry from around the Arras fighting in 1917 describes the feeling in plain soldier language. The pipes started, everyone knew the Scots were coming, the unit fired like crazy, men fell in front of the wire, and still it wasn't enough. The writer admits he ran, more like a confession than a brag, because staying felt like waiting to be swallowed. He wasn't proud, but he was alive. That's what psychological warfare looks like when it's real. Not a clever poster or a radio message. A reputation strong enough that men begin retreating before the fight is technically lost. And this is why the Highland charge, crazy as it sounds, sometimes worked in a war that should have made charges obsolete. It wasn't that Scottish units had discovered a secret weakness in machine guns. It was that they pushed the human system behind the machine guns past its breaking point. Three things mattered most. First, the willingness to take catastrophic losses to reach the line. If the attacker accepts casualties that would stop other units cold, the defender's math changes. The defender can kill hundreds and still end up losing the trench. Second, the speed in the final stretch. A defender might watch a normal advance for long minutes, adjusting aim, correcting fire. But when attackers suddenly close the last 100 meters fast, the time window to stop them shrinks to seconds. And seconds are where fear ruins performance. Third, the shock factor. The pipes, the kilts, the aggressive movement, officers forward. Everything about it signaled that the attackers were not going to stop halfway. That certainty was poison for defenders because defense depends on believing you can hold. There's one action in late 1916 that captures this perfectly. A German defensive line had already survived multiple assaults from other Allied units. The position was set up the way doctrine demanded: overlapping machine guns, wire, prepared fires, the whole thing. Then the 51st Highland Division attacked across a long stretch of open ground, so open that, on paper, it should have been a massacre and nothing more. And it was a massacre. But it wasn't only a massacre. Wave after wave came on. The first men went down. Another wave pressed forward, then another. And at some point, the defenders reached the moment every soldier fears, the realization that the enemy is not stopping, that your fire is not changing their decision, that they are going to reach you no matter how many you kill. That's when German units broke, not because they lacked bullets, but because something inside them snapped. Men started abandoning a perfect position because the alternative felt worse, staying and getting hit in close combat by attackers who seemed built for it. And once a defense breaks like that, it doesn't break neatly. It collapses in chunks. One section pulls back, the next gets flanked, another panics, and suddenly a line that was strong 10 minutes ago is gone. By now, you can see how the next step happens. If German troops believed Scottish units didn't reliably accept surrender in the chaos of an assault, and if Scottish units believed Germans were getting trigger-happy with Scottish prisoners, the battlefield became even more brutal. Not an official policy stamped in Berlin, a grim understanding born in mud and fear. And in Part 3, we're going to tackle that ugly loop head-on, how the prisoner issue escalated, how specific Scottish regiments gained specialized reputations, and why German post-war assessments, shockingly, often read less like hatred and more like wary respect for an enemy they never fully figured out. Once a unit's reputation reaches a certain level, it stops being a story and starts becoming a rule people fight by. That's what happened with Scottish regiments on the Western Front. By the middle years of World War I, German troops weren't just reacting to a single attack. They were reacting to a pattern they believed they understood. Pipes, kilts, relentless pressure, then brutal close combat. And when soldiers believe surrender won't save them, or believe prisoners might turn dangerous, the battlefield gets colder, faster, more lethal. This is where the shot-on-sight idea comes in. It's important to be precise. This wasn't some clean, universal, signed and stamped German national policy that applied everywhere, every day. War doesn't usually work that neatly at the front line. What happened instead was more scattered and grim. Local instructions, informal habits, and decisions made under stress, especially when a unit felt it couldn't safely handle prisoners in the middle of chaos. German forces had expectations about prisoners. Disarmed men can be marched back. Guards can control them. Most captives want to live and will comply. But Scottish troops, at least in the stories that German soldiers repeated, didn't always fit the safe captive stereotype in the minds of their captors. The fear was that even after surrender, a determined soldier might resist, attack, try to escape, or start a fight at the worst possible moment. That fear didn't have to be statistically common to matter. It just had to feel believable to exhausted men holding a trench with too few guards and too much danger. Now add the other half of the equation. Many Scottish assaults were fought in tight spaces. at point-blank range, with bayonets and improvised weapons. In that environment, prisoners are hard to take even if you want to. The moment you pause to process surrender, someone else might shoot you, someone might stab you, someone might lunge. So both sides could slide into the same brutal logic. If you think the enemy won't spare you, you're less likely to spare them. If you believe prisoners are dangerous to handle, you're less likely to take them. And if you fight enough battles where surrender feels uncertain, the whole idea of quarter starts to fade, especially in the most violent moments of assaults and counterattacks. That vicious loop is how rumors turn into reality. Not everywhere, not always, but enough that people at the front start acting like it's true. And once soldiers act like it's true, it becomes true. German documents and field guidance from the war sometimes reflected that ugly practicality in careful language. Prisoners can be problematic, security can be difficult, and unit safety can require harsh action. That's a sanitized way of saying, in the wrong moment, some men would be killed rather than taken. Scottish regiments didn't become feared because they were invincible. They became feared because they kept showing up where the fighting was hardest, and because they were used again and again as assault troops when other attacks stalled. That's also why their casualty numbers were so horrifying. Scottish divisions and regiments didn't just lose thousands, they lost more than their original strength because replacements kept arriving and getting fed into the same meat grinder. A division might have an establishment strength around 15,000, and over the course of the war suffer far more casualties than that through turnover. It's not that math is broken, it's that the unit is being rebuilt over and over, new men replacing dead men, while the name and the tradition remain. The Black Watch is a classic example of this kind of cost, a famous regiment that became legendary partly because so many of its men died doing the jobs other units couldn't pull off. German analysts tried to interpret what they were seeing and sometimes came to the wrong conclusion. They might say, "This is wasteful. This is reckless. This is not smart modern war." But they missed the point. The tactic wasn't designed to save lives. It was designed to take ground. Scottish assaults worked when other assaults failed because Scottish units, again and again, were willing to pay the price required to reach the enemy line. They were used as the hammer because commanders believed they would keep swinging even when it hurt. That willingness was a weapon, one bought with blood. And the German defense system, as strong as it was, had a human limit. You can't hold a position forever if the enemy is willing to keep coming until your nerve breaks. That's why German troops began developing specific fears about specific Scottish units. It wasn't just the Scots. It was certain names that carried extra weight. The Black Watch, for example, built a reputation for aggressive patrolling and raids, especially at night. For a German sentry, that kind of enemy is poison. Because you're not just scared during attacks, you're scared all the time. Every rustle in the wire could be a knife team. Every shadow could be a raid. That constant stress doesn't just make you tired, it makes you sloppy. And sloppy gets you killed. Other regiments were known in German accounts for stubborn defense and savage counterattacks, the kind that hit just when defenders expect the enemy to be exhausted and consolidating. Then there were units whose reputation centered on bayonet fighting, close-range aggression so intense that German soldiers described it as if the attackers actually wanted to get into the trench. Whether that was literally true in every case almost doesn't matter. What mattered was that German troops believed it, and belief shapes behavior. If you think an enemy enjoys close combat, you do not wait for them to reach you. You pull back before they close, or you die where you stand. That's the kind of thinking that turns a tactical situation into a psychological trap. Now, here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. Because this reputation didn't stay trapped in World War I, it echoed forward. In World War II, the details changed. Warfare changed. Kilts were not commonly worn into modern combat conditions the way they had been early in World War I. The battlefield was more mobile. The threats were different. But the identity, the regimental culture, stayed. Pipes still appeared. Traditions still mattered. The idea of aggressive infantry driven by unit pride and cohesion didn't vanish. And the 51st Highland Division became one of the clearest examples of that continuity. In 1940 in France, The division was cut off and eventually forced to surrender at St. Valery-en-Caux after being surrounded and running out of supplies. That wasn't a failure of spirit. That's what happens when you're trapped without the ability to resupply or break out. The key point is what happened after. The division was reformed in Britain and fought again. North Africa, Sicily, and Northwest Europe. German soldiers facing them later in the war sometimes recognized the unit's markers and tactics and drew an immediate conclusion. This is going to be a grind because these infantry don't stop easily. At battles like El Alamein in October 1942, Scottish units were part of major assaults that helped crack Axis defenses. And even when the bagpipes were more symbolic than tactical, the psychological impact wasn't imaginary. A tradition becomes a signal. A signal becomes a story. A story becomes fear. If your father fought in World War I and told you what pipes meant, if your older sergeant repeats it, then hearing pipes on a modern battlefield can still tighten your throat. It's not rational. It doesn't have to be. War isn't fought by perfectly rational machines. It's fought by humans carrying memories, rumors, and dread. After the wars, German assessments of Scottish units often sound surprisingly respectful. Not warm and friendly. War doesn't do that, but respectful in a professional way. The kind of respect that says these were capable infantry, not because they had better rifles, but because they had better cohesion and a harder will to quit. That's the thread tying the whole story together. German analysts noticed Scottish units typically had standard British equipment. They didn't have magic. They weren't super soldiers, but they fought like they had something that mattered to them beyond staying alive. A regimental culture that emphasized aggressive action, a tradition that made retreat feel shameful. Distinct symbols, pipes, kilts, names that built identity stronger than fear, and an accumulated reputation that each new group of soldiers felt pressured to live up to. If you belong to a unit known for attacking when others hesitate, you're less likely to hesitate. Not because you don't feel fear, but because you feel something else too. Pride, expectation, the weight of history, the need not to be the guy who breaks the chain. That's why the Ladies from Hell nickname evolved. It started as mockery, men in skirts, how ridiculous. Then it became shorthand for an enemy that didn't behave the way defenders expected, and by the later years, it carried something close to grim admiration. These were elite assault troops, and if you faced them, you'd better be ready for close combat and heavy losses. Some German veterans after the wars used language that's blunt and almost poetic in its simplicity. They had to call them something. And devils alone didn't capture the contradiction. Skirts paired with ferocity, music paired with killing, tradition paired with modern brutality. And that contradiction is the core of the story. Because the kilts weren't just cloth, they were a message. The pipes weren't just music, they were pressure. The charges weren't reenactments. They were a method, violent, costly, sometimes effective, built to break a defense's human limit. And the shoot them on sight idea, whether it was spoken openly or implied in the dirt, came from the same place. Fear mixed with practicality in the ugliest environment humans ever created. So when you hear the Ladies from Hell, don't picture a joke. Picture a German trench line hearing pipes at dawn, knowing what comes next, and realizing the worst part isn't the bullets. The worst part is the moment you understand these attackers are going to keep coming until one side is gone. The Germans called them the Ladies from Hell. They learned to fear the kilts. They learned to fear the pipes. And after 2 world wars, even many of the men who survived on the other side admitted the truth the nickname was trying to capture. Those weren't costumes. Those weren't theatrics. They were weapons, built from identity, tradition, and a willingness to pay any price to win the fight in front of them.